My children make a lot of fun of me when they hear this term serial entrepreneur. It says it seems like serial killer almost. So, but it is just, I think it is a tag that has taken. So I would say, if I look back at my journey, when the first time I started, it was kind of okay, this looks interesting. Of all of the options that I had landed in the Bay Area, and I was looking at, what next, and this idea sounded very good, and more than the idea, actually, the people who were building it. So, it was a couple of one of my friends from IIT Delhi. He was 2 years senior to me. One or two other people I knew, and the idea so that it was just the joy of building something together with the people you enjoy being with was what it was. But the second time I started in Teletalks, it was a more thought out decision, and it was more of kind of, here is a problem that I'm seeing, and now I can't unsee it, and I can't sit by the sidelines and just see this problem. So, what do I do about it? And, starting a company and doing something about it is one way of addressing that. And the third is been a similar process of saying yes in education. I do see this challenge of us not being able to introduce our children to the next generation technologies that are already defining their lives and will define them, and they need to be prepared for this world. But schools completely miss out in that aspect. So what do we do about it? And especially the last two came a lot because after my daughter was born, I kind of began to see these things in early years education that look, I started to read about brain development and neuroscience, and how children's brain develop, and learn that 85% of the brain development happens in the first 3 years of our lives. And so what was bothersome is, why don't we give it adequate attention in our education system or in our learning system? And that was kind of the driver for it. So I would say, starting different companies, it's kind of a journey in exploring yourself a little better as to what you want to do. And I think with each experience, you also gain a little bit of confidence and knowledge of how to do things better next time, or what you could have done better this time, or how do you want to structure it. So I think it's essentially an evolution in your depth of thinking, your learning, and also confidence in being able to pull off bigger and bigger objectives that you set for yourself.
So how did you decide that this is what you wanted to do? You were pursuing BTech at IIT Delhi. So what experiences motivated you to shift to founding your own startups? What happened then?
Yeah. So Suhani, I think it's easy to kind of put frameworks on some of the actions you took when you took them, and I do that now. But at that time, it just seemed like I was clueless, and I was making decisions on, okay, I don't enjoy this, or I like this, and therefore I'm going to go down this path. So I was pursuing. Your generation is a lot more aware of what you want. There is a lot more information flow. I had no idea what I was getting into when I was getting into IIT and chemical engineering. I didn't even have too many preconceived notions of what it would be like. So as I entered, as I started at IIT, I enjoyed just the atmosphere and the learning and the challenge. But just the chemical engineering subjects, I didn't feel a connection with at all. And despite trying, I couldn't really see myself doing chemical engineering. So like you, I also did a minor in business studies, because just again to explore whether that is something I will like. I enjoyed all of the humanities courses. I enjoyed all of the kind of the physics courses. So the natural sciences courses I enjoyed a lot, and then the management courses. So through that experience, I thought, okay, I'm going to, as far as work is concerned, I would like to work in an area where it is more about building a company, developing strategy for the company, working in teams, and so on. So I joined a startup called Solutions. It was run by an alum of IIT Kanpur and sounded very interesting to me. It was all about marketing strategies and planning and so on, and then moved to strategy consulting. So I had an offer from Infosys when I was on campus, and I thought, look, I can't imagine. I didn't feel excited about coding, so I decided to join Solutions, which was a really small startup marketing consulting firm. But to just kind of now on all of that, the framework I put is, you do not think your way forward, you always build your way forward. So while it's very common to say, oh, you have to find your passion, and I'm passionate about this, and I am passionate about coding, and it's not as if you can just keep thinking about it and it will come to you. It is only through experimentation, it's only through action, it's only through building your way forward that you realize, oh, this is something I enjoy more than this, or when I do this, I am in a state of flow. I forget what's going on and I can spend hours and hours doing this. And that's when you realize, oh yeah, I want to do more of this and less of that. So that's one of the kind of frameworks I use a lot, is you build your way forward. You don't think your way forward. Your ideas, through just this mental analysis and through creating spreadsheets, these are the pros and these are the cons of doing it, and you need certain level of background analysis on the decisions you make, but eventually it boils down to really experiencing it as you go along. Family and friends around, we build a pilot. So we did it by the Silicon Valley book, in a way. We built a pilot product, then went out and raised an angel round. We got some pilot customers, and we were looking for Series A funding. When the crash of 2000 happened, so pretty much there was a complete meltdown in the technology world, across the world, and the company went under. So I think two things that I kind of took from that experience. One was, always build for the customer. Never lose sight of the customer, even as you are raising funding and talking to VCs and getting a lot of advice from them. Never lose sight of the customer, because finally it is the customer who will buy the product. So in that case, it was a company called Eliance, and we were building an enterprise software platform, an enterprise platform for vendor management. And SaaS was not a term we used at that time, but we were kind of envisaging a platform where companies could manage their partnerships and vendors. And as we talked to VCs, we got multiple ideas. You should go in this direction, you should be doing this, you should be doing this, and we pivoted multiple times. I think in hindsight, just keeping your eye on the customer all the time is very important. That's the most important stakeholder as you build it, right? And the product that you want to build until you get to product market fit. That is one. And the second was that, despite everything you might do, there are environmental factors that will lead to your success or to your demise or failure. So I think we tend to take things very hard and personally, and a lot of the success and sometimes a lot of the failure is dependent on environmental factors, and it's important to remind yourself of that, because when the crash happened, just and a lot of times your success is also because of that. And I'll just give you an example. When the second company, IntelliThoughts, we started, and it was with a batchmate of mine from IIT Delhi. Both of us kind of had similar journeys. We were in the US, we were coming back to India. Our children were of the same age, and he said both of us were struggling with the same questions. He said, okay, let's start IntelliThoughts. I was with Adobe at that time, so I quit Adobe and started that. She had spent almost quite a few years with Infosys across different parts of the world. So we decided to bootstrap it for a variety of reasons. One, the experience of running Alliance and building Alliance while raising money was very fresh in my mind. And two, at that stage of life when my children and Shivani's children were very little, so my daughter was 1 year old, one was 1 year old and the second one was 3 years old. I wanted flexibility, and I knew the moment you take any money from anyone, that flexibility is gone. So the primary driving factor at that time is flexibility. I am willing to work hard, but we'll we'll grow it at our own terms. So that time, we kind of set it up and started to work on this, and we set up preschools, daycare centers. We had a lot of online teacher training programs and so on, and we were growing fine. But suddenly we realized that we were getting a lot of attention from these large companies like Oracle and IBM, and asking us if we would be willing to set up daycare centers for them across the country. And I was like, what is happening? Essentially, it was a policy change where the maternity benefits bill came out, and the government said every company with more than 80 employees needs to have a daycare center. So suddenly people were looking for credible organizations who could help do that, and therefore that led to kind of our growth at that stage, right? So that was that. And now in my third startup, Avishkar, we are going again the fundraising route. We have raised our 2 rounds of funding, seed and pre-series A round of funding recently. We're looking to raise series A round of funding soon. And it is right now a lot about building the right team to grow, and it's also a space which is very crowded. A lot of disruption is happening right now in EdTech, so it's again not something that we can decide, okay, we are going to move slow and it's going to be okay. So it's important for us to execute well and have a clear plan of action and have capital to be able to bring our plans to execution. So I think I would say a lot depends on your understanding of what you want for yourself at what stage of life.
So 20 years from now on, do you think schools will be significant? Many powerful edtech startups are rising, coming on the horizon. So what do you feel? Will these startups be able to completely replace schools?
So Suhani, I feel that our education system has been in a state of disruption for a while. Clayton Christensen has this theory of the disruptive innovation, right? How there are some technologies that completely upend a particular industry, and there are examples in microprocessors, in Sony Walkman, and how the incumbents actually didn't see it coming, and it was the upstarts who were able to do it. And essentially, when you talk about disruptive innovation, which is literally like a step up, it's not incremental, it's like you just completely change to the next stage, right? So in education, it has been coming up for a long time now. It's been, it started on the fringes where, we started to see MOOCs coming up 2 decades ago with Coursera and edX and FutureLearn and so on, right? So these were like massive open online courses. A lot of the content was taken from your textbooks and put on there. The business models were hard to come by. It has taken a very long time. But now gradually what we started to see in higher ed was that now if you do a course on Coursera or an edX at your own place without the location constraints, you essentially can get a credit for that course in UPenn or in Wharton or in Johns Hopkins, right? If you've done that course. Now Georgia Tech has many credit courses like that. I think in India also they are working with IIM Calcutta and so on for credit level courses. So I think one factor that you see happening across industries and across education is we are not bound by location anymore. Earlier location used to be a big challenge. That suppose, when you're looking for jobs, you have to be at this location to be able to work in that company. If earlier a lot of the growth was coming from our natural resources, if you're working with Port Authority, you have to be there only. Right? Now a lot of our world, our jobs, our lives have become location independent. And you have seen that happen in different industries. You have seen that happen in hospitality. So, when you look at companies like Oyo or Airbnb, they basically said, Acha, you have this property lying vacant, you can use it anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter. So location independence is what, and another one is transport, logistics, Uber having done that, or in entertainment, you see changing formats, right? So in education as well, I feel that schools will continue to have a role. In fact, the teacher's role will become even more important because it will shift, but it will become more important because information is widely available now. You can get what you want anywhere you want, pretty much free of cost. The challenge that a learner faces is how to sift through that. What is important? How do you create a personalized learning path for yourself? And when you get stuck, you need help. So again, long-winded answer, but to answer your question of, schools, yes, they will exist. They will probably exist as the really premium form of experience because they're very expensive form of education.
Right.
Even if you look at big colleges like Harvard or Stanford, I mean, the debt problem is huge there now. So it is a premium learning experience only available for 2,000 or 3,000 children. But now the same material and the same professors could be teaching 200,000 children at the same time. So the pricing will go down. And it will be, we'll have solutions along the spectrum, which we are seeing in higher ed already, where yes, you have an on-campus experience, but you have on the other hand a completely online experience. And then there is a mix along the spectrum, which is different forms of hybrid. So someone like a Minerva project, they say, okay, the first month you are going to come to our San Francisco campus, you'll work together and then go back to your own countries, and then we'll meet again 6 months later in Buenos Aires, right? So it will essentially be a full spectrum from saying pure online to pure offline, with pure online being the cheapest, asynchronous forms of teaching, video, etc., with no support, to on-campus, pure on-campus experience being really expensive, and then things in the middle, where you will have options of business models to choose from. And that's happened in higher ed. I believe that that's happening in the K-12 education as well, where education is going to the learner. The learner doesn't have to come to the school per se to learn, and we've seen that in COVID, where through their devices they can reach all of that. And secondly, you have different models to choose from. You could be going to the campus on the weekends for 2 days to play and to use the lab and so on, and rest of the time you're doing it at home. Or you only go to the school for 2 hours a day, remainder you are able to work at home. While there is, so a school today which is able to cater to only 2,000 children, and for the rest of the time the capacity is lying vacant and is not being used, could say, oh, I can actually enroll 20,000 children now, because they will come for 3 hours and there are teachers who are teaching online for another amount of time. And so the capacity utilization of these physical buildings will become much better. So again, to sum it up, 3 things I think. One is location independence will happen. The models will be along a spectrum from pure online to physical. And the third thing, third is capacity utilization of physical assets will become higher. And actually the fourth is that the role of the teacher will become even more important. We will see star teachers emerging, much like, in every field there are the star athlete and a star doctor and a star lawyer. But in teaching profession, we didn't see that. And now, because of the ability to be able to service 50,000 students or 20,000, you'll see some star professors and star teachers emerging. So role of the teacher will become even more important in the learning journey.
Coming to college experience, what have been some of your fondest memories from IIT?
When you ask that, the thing that flashed back to me was Rendezvous and us singing I Want to Break Free in the wind tunnel. I think Rendezvous was just like every year was just so much fun, and at that time it was completely kind of student organized. There were very few sponsorships available, but it was just a wonderful time we had. The other is again all of the we'd be doing drama practice, or we'd be doing singing practice in the the SAC or in the SEM hall, and then 12 o'clock at night we'd go and get anda paratha next to, I don't know if it still exists, but it was like it used to open only at about 11 p.m. So we'd go get anda paratha at that time. So most of the fun memories are extracurricular at IIT, and all the time we spent with friends, I'd say.
Certainly, online learning cannot compensate for that.
That is right. And some of the deepest friendships, I'll say, were forged there. So when I was planning, I moved from Gurgaon to Bangalore with my family. My family moved from Gurgaon to Bangalore about 4 years ago. So when we were thinking about moving here, it was literally like, okay, where are we going to move? Which complex? It was very simple. Two of my friends, closest friends from Kailash, were in this complex. So it was like, okay, we are moving next to them. So some lifelong friendships got forged at that time, and they've continued to grow stronger over the years.
To that, what do you think? Is there something missing in the way tech is taught at IIT Delhi? We see a lot of students, losing interest in tech and then moving out to different fields. So, what do you think could be done to ameliorate this situation?
So Suhani, my memory is that it was very theoretical and research oriented. So at least all of the chemical engineering syllabus was very, very. It was almost like we were getting prepared for doing a master's thereafter. So it was very theoretical, and it was very research oriented. I in my head it was like, you're doing chemical engineering, then we learned how to build a factory that allows you to make paste, or that allows you to design a chemical reactor. And that is why some of the courses that I enjoyed was CRE, chemical reaction. I've forgotten the name also, but there used to be a Professor Amar. Oh, that's another strong memory, where he was a terror for chemical engineering folks. And in tutorials, he would just call us by name and ask us to go on the board and solve problems. And then if you didn't get it, like you had it there. But I also learned the most in his course and enjoyed it a lot. But I would say more hands-on experience, more live experiences in the world. So even if it is a concept which is theoretical, if more lab work and giving more importance to lab work, essentially I felt like lab work was almost peripheral to the coursework that we did. It was something that we had to do, and we do, but more integrating lab work and hands-on learning in the curriculum as a more integral part would something I'd like to see, and I'm hoping it's probably changed somewhat from that time. And second is live learning experience. So internships pretty much starting from early on, or a kind of collaboration with the industry, so that students are able to step out in the real world more often than just doing that one internship at one project at the end of third year, in the third year summer, would I think be very, very valuable. Because again, as we were talking about how education is evolving and changing, that technologies are changing at such a fast pace that what was relevant even 4 years earlier when you joined IIT have evolved to the next level now. A coding language that was in vogue. I'm forever kind of just trying to keep track of what are the new things that are coming up, because the way you build products, the way you build apps, the way you build software platforms, they're changing now. You would physically code them, and then I started to see developers actually just being able to take blocks of code from GitHub or Stack Overflow, use it. So you're not doing everything from scratch. To now there are low code and no code platforms, and there is actually a marketplace for no code platforms where you can actually pick from those from those platforms, so you don't have to physically. So I think the pace of technological change is so high that it is important for students, especially at IIT and in engineering colleges, to have a very close connect with the world and have that experience. That is one. And the second is also, besides engineering knowledge, when you are going out in the real world, there are other skills that you require and learn to succeed, right? Collaboration, teamwork, being able to put your ideas forward in a meaningful way, communication skills, being able to really convince your team of an idea, and those are very, very valuable skills as you grow through your career. So the more we can expose students to those skills while they are in college, it will become a much more richer and meaningful experience.
What do you think? Only 10% of startup founders in India are women. This is such a small number in proportion to our population. So what do you think? What is your take on this situation? How do you think we can improve here?
So I am still trying to define the problem. There is a quote that says, "A problem well defined is half solved."
Correct.
And it is a big challenge, and I'm thinking a lot about it right now, and talking to a lot of people to understand this better, because it is indeed bothersome that, it's, for me, it's been 25 years since I left campus, and I would have thought that in 25 years, the way so many different things have evolved, this issue will cease to exist, or at least would have improved. But in a way, what I see is actually the numbers and have actually declined or plateaued, right? So in this day and age, to say only 10% of the founders are women it just doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense from a gender perspective, but also from an socio-economic benefit perspective. So or from a company performance perspective, I think there is enough data and research coming out that companies or even states companies which are more diverse end up providing a better return to the shareholders. If you look at states where the gender ratio is better, have better education outcomes, have better health outcomes, have better economic outcomes. The GDP per capita is much better. Income per capita is much better. And I'll give you an example. For example, if you just compare a state in North and South, I ended up reading that article just this morning. So, if you look at Bihar, the gender ratio is very bad there. And that kind of completely aligns with poor economic performance and per capita income there. Whereas if you take a state like Tamil Nadu, the gender ratio is great, the education levels for women is great, and therefore the per capita income is also great. And I think there is enough research coming out to prove that. And therefore, I don't understand why we are not able to make this shift. And I have some hypotheses based on some of the readings and research from thinkers in this area. I think one is just the socio-economic factors are it's hard. One thinks so the problem exists at every stage. It is at the time that children are deciding on their field, whether they are going to take STEM, whether they are going to take liberal arts, whether they are going to go for a professional degree, non-professional degree, and you see that there are lesser number of girls taking STEM subjects, and what happens is STEM subjects end up being the high paying and the high growth. If you take a STEM subject, you end up being on a high paying, high growth trajectory than a non-STEM subject. So while not all girls would take that, but even with a 50% ratio, what we see is that just women take lesser, girls take lesser for variety of reasons, and girls' parents also push lesser for them to push themselves in this field, again for a variety of reasons, right? Social reasons. Then the second is when you enter college, right? The numbers go down. When they take up jobs, that number goes down. And in entrepreneurship, so middle manager level drop off and gap, I understand, because a lot of women decide to have children, then you kind of get off the corporate circle, or like I said, the second startup I did, I wanted flexibility. I didn't want to do a really high growth startup at that point and raise a lot of capital. But so you see a lot of women kind of dropping off the corporate ladder, or not do very aggressive startups during that stage of middle manager, and that essentially coincides with the time when your career is really taking off, because in the first 5 to 8 years, it's like you are proving yourself and you are kind of pushing yourself and saying, okay, I can do this, and you are selling yourself to the employers. After 8-9 years, when you have some already evidence in your back, you've done well, then you begin to get offers. People begin to seek you out. They want you in their teams, they want you in their companies, they want you to be a co-founder with them, right? And that coincides literally with kind of 30 to 40 year age bracket. So that is kind of biological, and as a society we have to think about it, and policies and regulations need to come and play there. And then, women founders and entrepreneurs, again, so I'll give you two examples. One is when I moved back to India from the US, and I had moved back with Adobe. I was managing product marketing for Acrobat at Adobe in the US, and then moved back to India with Adobe in Noida. And when I was coming back after 10-12 years, and I came back, and from just coming in and out of the elevator, I thought, oh wow, the gender ratio is really improved. It's just like I by and large saw almost 50% women, 50% men. And then I was in a leadership meeting of Asia Pac folks, and there must have been I'd say about 100 senior people there, and there were only 3 women in the room. So that really struck me, including me, and that really struck me, because I was like, oh, I thought we were 50-50. So it is essentially at the entry point there was a lot of kind of balance, and then when you got to mid-manager level is then suddenly the numbers dropped. And then no surprise, then once the numbers have dropped there, then at the senior level and the board level, again the numbers will be low, because the pipeline has been curtailed there, right? In the entrepreneur world, what I see is, when I was running IntelliThoughts, I worked with a lot of mothers and interacted with a lot of mothers who had little kids. So I saw so many women doing cool stuff. They were, catering from home, creating art, or running something here, a small outfit there, a marketing consulting firm from home. So there are a lot of women entrepreneurs out there who are kind of building stuff, making stuff, adding value. However, when you look at funded companies, you see that number to be only 10%. Right? So especially in COVID times, I saw so many women start their catering businesses, and through WhatsApp, they're sending tiffins, and they're sending all sorts of, if they're in the farm, they're sending fruits, vegetables, all of those things, right? But the funded companies, you kind of stop there to say, I don't know what happens, why sometimes. So 2 or 3. So last year I started to do something about it, and I said, okay, I'll make myself available to any woman entrepreneur who wants to discuss their business plan. And so Saturday mornings I reserve for that, and I started this small organization called CEO Club. And essentially through my conversations with almost, I'd say about 150 entrepreneurs through the last year and a half, a couple of factors have come out. One is just the fear of dreaming big. What will happen if I do that? That will just rock the boat on the family front, or I don't have it in me to be able to do that. I'm not a numbers person. And so that is one, just dreaming big, the ability to take risk, just kind of, okay, I'll risk it. I mean, what's the worst thing that will happen? So that is one thing I hear over and over again. The second is just the discomfort in networking and going out and asking for help, and being comfortable and saying, okay, can you help me with this? Can this happen? So on, contacts, and keeping our relationships, professional relationships, and even personal relations. And the irony is, women are naturally great at maintaining relationships, but somehow the break happens there. The third part of it is sometimes I see skills as well. So I think you are at IIT, you have exposure to a lot of different things, but if you've not had exposure to a lot of those things, you feel uncomfortable with business plans. How do I create a pitch deck? How do I evaluate a term sheet? How do I create a financial model, a business model, or even doing the basic numbers on the business? How do I go about doing that? So there is a bit of a skill gap there. And the fourth is funding. But I'd say raising funding is hard for anyone, a guy or a woman. And so I think those are the four things that I feel we have to work on at different levels. And I think it's a complex problem. It's not a simple problem. And but with more and more kind of role models, women leaders coming up and talking about their journeys, supporting. Actually, what is important is to be paid forward in a way to be there for the women entrepreneurs, or even the corporate leaders as they are navigating their professional journeys is important. And I'm very I am fortunate that I have just a bunch of friends who have made themselves available to mentor women entrepreneurs, to be there just as a sounding board, to support with connections and sometimes even funding. So we've started to fund a lot of women-led, some women-led startups, and take a step forward there. So it's a big problem that we need to address, but I'm hopeful that there are enough people working on it, and we'll see change happen.
What do you do when you have an idea? How do you pitch it? How do you get the funding? Basically, how do you build a team? Those are some of the questions that we had.
So yeah, I think this is one of the most exciting developments that I see, is that so many students are already working on those ideas while on campus. So at that time you are kind of so into the whole learning process, and the ability to bring something to fruition is so high. So it's one of the most exciting developments, I think. So it's great. One of the frameworks that I find very useful is the design thinking framework. When you are thinking about taking anything from idea to launch, so the first step, of course, is understanding the problem and empathizing with the customer and understanding what really is the problem. Many a times what I see an engineering approach to this is that I am seeing a problem, and I will create a product or a solution to solve that, right? And that's a good approach, that works. However, what is important is, if you are thinking about making it into a business, definitely extend it backwards to understand the customer need there a little bit. Even if it means talking to a few of your friends or to a few of your family, different kinds of people who you think will be the customer, to understand whether there is really a need for a product like this or not. Right? So that is the first step. The second is you ideate. So once you see the problem and I guess if you look at the framework, it is you empathize, you think about the customer problem, you ideate, you build a prototype, then you test, and then you take it to market, right? So, and then you create. Now, if you have already created a product which you think based on your need that solves the problem, just go backward a little bit to say, okay, does the customer really need it? And if not, then can I extend that idea a little bit? Do I change it? Do I modify it? and ideate on that to come up back to a product which will meet the customer need a lot better than what your original idea was. And then go from there to test it out with the market and then enhance it. So that is one when it comes to just the product. And that's kind of one part of product market fit, if you will. The other part of the product market fit will be when you're going to market, you will also need to understand whether it's viable, right? So one is the product, it's a great product, it just does all sorts of cool things. Now, when you are taking it to market or building a company around it, you'll have to see who will buy it, at what price, how will I make sure that the customer gets to that product in this highly crowded market, how much will I have to spend to get this in the customer's hands, how will I have, once I put it out there will be 5 other competitors who would want to take this, how do I protect it with IP and trademark law and so on. And then do I really need to raise capital in order to make it that big? So then product is just one part of it, and then there is all the market and the customer and the distribution channels and the pricing that will make it tick. So suppose and I'll tell you, for example, we have a fantastic robotic product for a 5-year-old. It is it's really world-class product. It has nice blocks. You can program it. The child can actually get the robot to go pick something up, bring it, make sounds, all of that. It's called Tweak, Avishkar Tweak. It's 12,000 rupees. So in the Indian market, it is you can only sell so many pieces in the Indian market. If we were to take it to Singapore or probably to the US, there will be a much larger market available for this. So if that is the only product you're talking about and you bang your head against in this market saying, I want to sell 100,000 of these products in 1 year at 12,000 rupees, I know you won't be able to do it. So understanding the market dynamics, the size of the market, who you are selling to, what will they pay for that service, who are the other players in the market who are selling a much better product or even a lower quality product but at a lower price and customers are buying. All of those things become very important, and I think the good news is that today you don't have to depend on anyone to do this. I mean, information is available, learning is, if you have created this and you want to take it to market, a baseline understanding you can get from attending a few webinars of entrepreneurs who are building companies or doing one basic course to say, okay, how do you take a product to market or how do you make product market fit happen, right? So I think that the students will have to identify. Also, I would say that there are enough successful entrepreneurs now that have come out of the whole IIT Delhi, IIT Bombay, IT system, IIM. So it is really, again, very exciting to see that there is a network of successful entrepreneurs who are making themselves available to pay it forward, and they are very, very approachable. They are very supportive when it comes to, if you are seeking help, advice, they make themselves available. And there is a huge advantage to having that ecosystem at work, because entrepreneurship can be a very hard and lonely journey. And there is a lot of uncertainty, unanswered questions. So when you are able to brainstorm or seek advice from someone who's already charted that path before or made some of those mistakes before, that can be very helpful. So I would say seek help, go online, learn about those parts of your blind spots, and then go out and take your product to market and raise capital on an as needed basis. Again, capital fundraising, I would just make one point about fundraising. in our media, it is glamorized a lot. You almost associate building a company with fundraising, and if you've not fundraised a company and built it without fundraising, it's like nobody knows about it. So as a wannabe entrepreneur, you kind of like, oh, if I've not raised funds, then maybe I've not done anything significant. It's important to protect your interests as a founder as you raise funds. It's important to understand that to raise capital only when you need it and as much as you need it, because you do give part. It's the most expensive form of raising capital, giving equity. So think deep and hard about it, and of course, then there are like, the good news is there are enough incubators, and there are enough, the VC ecosystem in the country and angel networks in the country is a thriving ecosystem now. So it's a good time to be an entrepreneur in India right now and in the world. So I would say, so seek mentors, clear your blind spots, and understand why you're building what you're building and for whom. If anybody wants to reach out to me, they can either kind of ping me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to.
For sure. So we have one question. You have been in the startup journey for 20 odd years, and you also did not take up on the offer from the campus placements, as you mentioned. But there is a lot of undue importance. It would not be fair to say undue, but there is a lot of additional importance that is placed on placements from campus, whether it be during job placements or internships. What is your take on that?
So Hani, I can imagine it is stressful, and a lot of students who are there have worked very hard, are ambitious, driven people. So you really, after spending so much effort, time, resources, you really want to optimize it, and there are advantages to getting a great placement from campus. Doing it out of campus is much harder and riskier as well. But what I want to say is, the good news is that you've already kind of achieved a local optimum, if you will, right? So when we think of our at that point, if I look back at my worldview at that time, you look at your career journey as this linear graph that, as time goes by, and how you rise, and as a professional, it's literally a linear graph. You will just go like this. And rarely have I come across a successful professional who's had this linear graph. There are a few, but a large majority don't have that. A large majority's career graphs look something like tung, 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 tung. Sometimes you're stuck in a valley, and then there is an up, or you are plateau for a while and then go down, right? So I would say, while one should obviously try to optimize the campus placement, and that's the easiest, that's the best and the easiest way to start your career journey. But play the long game mostly. Playing the long game helps. These are all small decisions in a long game that you are playing. So it's more like a marathon rather than a sprint. Your career and your life is more like a marathon rather than a sprint. So you kind of, it's not this next 1 year, 2 year, 5 years. The other is, it's not a linear curve. So a lot of the times, it's more of an exponential curve. In the first few years of your career, you are kind of investing in building skills, learning, building credibility, building trust, your tribe of people. And then there are these, like a hockey stick curve that happens after a certain stage, that you're able to then people seek you out, then markets seek you out, that, you begin to see returns to that. So I'll end it by saying that when you think about your life or your career, don't think of it as an engineering problem. When we think of engineering problems, there is typically one solution to the problem that you are solving, right? It's more of a design problem. And when in an engineering problem, there is one solution. In a design problem, there are 5 different ways to design the solution to what you're looking for. So when I think of a career or a life, it's more of a design problem. There are 5 different ways to get to what you want to get to. And each of those paths could be very fulfilling on their own paths. So while it's okay to try and optimize on-campus placements, there are 5 different paths to get to what you want to accomplish. And I've seen so many of my friends and people I respect take like widely ranging different paths to get to what they want, and they're happy and fulfilled about it. So I would say your on-campus placement path just looks like this, but there are so many other paths that you can take to get there, and there'll be troughs and valleys along the way.